Art program. I'm really pleased that you're here, and I'm pleased that James and Chelsea are here as well for the reading. Just to say, just by the way, this is the end of the exhibition. The Prepared is coming at some midday tomorrow, and we're going to pull the show, and it's going to go off to the next venue. So I've been really pleased, having the opportunity to have the photography here and that interface of the written word, and then also I think a kind of visual poetics. In a range of sort of visual poetics throughout. I think you get a better, and we were just talking up here, I think you get a better sense of the exhibition and really infused with the poetry from the anthology. So if people are interested, it's $25. I'm giving it back to, I'm selling this on behalf of Georgia Council for the Arts. So if people wanted a catalog, we can facilitate that. I can also mention, again, I feel like the spokesperson for Georgia Council for the Arts, but they have a survey here. And if you leave your email at the bottom, obviously complete it, leave your email at the bottom. Tomorrow I'm going to do the raffle somehow and choose someone, and they will receive a free copy of the Inspired Georgia Anthology. So just to say, so as I say, welcome and enjoy the evening here. Hello.
Hi.
Give the buffers up.
Well, I'm Sandy Meek of Department of English, and so I've been just thanking the Georgia Poetry Circuit, Georgia Poets Initiative, and especially thanking Professor Rathburn and Professor Mays for coming to be with us today. I trust you've already silenced your devices. So, following the reading, we do have books for sale in the back. The bookstore is selling them, so for that you can use cards, cash, anything you want. And our readers would be very happy to sign them for you. So, I'm now going to introduce two fabulous creative writing students who will be doing the introductions of our guest speakers. So first will be Kathleen Miner, who is doubling as photographer, and our second will be Siobhan Mulligan. So let's thank them.
Thank you all for coming to this reading brought to you by the Georgia Poetry Circuit. It is my honor to introduce James Davis May, or Jim, as I came to know him this morning. Jim's first book of poetry, Unquiet Things, published by Louisiana State University Press in 2016, was finalist for the Georgia Author of the Year Award in Poetry. His poems have appeared or are forthcoming in 5 Points, the Missouri Review, New England Review, New Ohio Review, the New Republic, Pleiades, the Southern Review, and elsewhere. Recipient of the Poetry Society of America's Cecil Hemley Award, Memorial Award in 2016, he has received scholarships from the Sewanee Writers Conference, Imprint, and the Krakow Poetry Seminar. Chelsea and Jim are married, and both are assistant professors of English and creative writing at Young Harris College, where Chelsea also directs the creative writing program. With his writing, Jim demonstrates a mastery of simile and metaphor, and from his poems of violence, love, youth, and the natural world, he pulls beauty from even the most awful summer jobs to paint pictures of this earth and the human experience that shock me with their ingenuity and their fresh, new look on what seemed, before reading, to be so mundane. The pollen that causes me only pain for the entire month of April struck me with a childlike awe when Jim pointed out the way it shimmers there, like a firework that somehow doesn't fall, and the way when it does, children run through it, swearing to their mothers that it's snowing. I've lived in North Georgia my whole life, and I was struck again and again by the new take on these things I've lived with for so long and never really seen. Jim writes of the splendor and softness of love as well, and at the same time, he will never shy away from violence and tragedy, like these lines of the poem Birkenau, where he writes of the minor atrocities of the living during a tour through a death camp, and highlights the true power of a line break. Children playing tag on the tracks, leading to the gas chamber's rubble. I had to include that because I'm a World War II nerd, and that was like really powerful. Jim chills you to the bone, while only a few pages earlier he made you laugh out loud. And I think these lines from his last poem in Unquiet Things sum up his work, as I see it, better than I ever could. If you began to believe, as the boy did, that the world not only acknowledges your suffering, but turns to soothe it, what choice would you have but to love the world you so appallingly don't understand? Now it is truly my honor to welcome Jim May.
Thank you, Kathleen. It's nice to just sit here and hear nice things being said about me. Thank you, Sandy, for having me and having us, and all you do for poetry. You guys are very lucky here at Barry College. Hi, Rick. How are you? So it's very important to know that we're married. I'm glad that was mentioned. I didn't know what to do for this reading. We were talking about, my book's been out for almost 2 years now, and I'm trying to think of ways of organizing the reading, and what I decided with is I'm just going to read poems about my wife. Just at the start. And the talk today, we sat in a class, we got a lot of questions, many of you were there, and one of them, just about what, how do we function as a couple that writes about each other, and so this is sort of fitting. I'm going to read a poem called To My Lover's Ex-Husband. She wasn't my wife back then, she was my lover. She's still my lover. There's a Robert Frost poem. My first real love was Robert Frost, and there's a poem called The Tuft of Flowers. And in it, he's sort of turning he's making hay after someone has cut the grass ahead of him, and he keeps looking for this guy, and he can't find him, and then that butterfly comes by and lands on a tuft of flowers, and he decides that the mower has left the guy who's mowing has left them for him. It's kind of an egotistical thing. But he says in his mind, he says, men work together, I said within my heart, whether they work together or apart. And I like that idea, but we also sort of mess up. And this poem's sort of like that. Anyways, To My Lover's Ex-Husband. This morning, looking behind the bed in the guest room as I prepared it for company, you must have stayed there in the last few nights of the marriage, I found your vomit, long since dried, spackled across the wall and relieved of its scent, which, from what I've heard, was probably a bourbon with accents of barley and hops. And yesterday, as the Cardinals lost the feeders to the Jays, Chelsea and I spent a long time ripping the English ivy from the lawn. We talked about you, the pain you caused her. Mostly, though, we cursed you for doing nothing about the ivy when years ago you told her you were going to do something about the ivy. You've become almost a god, some genius loci of neglect, indifference, and mistakes. Yet I know somewhere someone might be thinking the same about me. The woman I moved to Houston with, married now to the second bassoonist in the symphony, no doubt recites my faults. And he has promised himself and her that he will be better than me, and he is. They probably even have jokes where my secrets, once promised as secrets, wait faithfully at the punchline. Or if they're past that, it's because they bonded over talks about how I hurt her, talked her into moving to the armpit of Texas only to leave her 3 months later. Which isn't true exactly, but I scrub the wall. The water softens the crust and revives, for a moment, your bile, its eye-watering stench. So one of the nice things about being married to a poet is, and there are many nice things, but you have your first reader, right? As soon as I finish a poem, I'll take it to Chelsea and then wait and sort of pace while she reads it, and I'll watch her. Usually I leave, but sometimes I'll watch her face as she's reading it. And but the problem too is if you're writing about an incident that's happened, sometimes you have to confess some things. And so that's what this poem's about. And it's called Nostos. I think it explains itself. We had not quite been arguing that night, but talking, discussing how I answer any mood of yours that falls below cheery contentment with a litany of solutions, as if trying to help you find the right word for a crossword puzzle. Sometimes the heart wants to be sad and say so and be heard, you said, or seemed to be saying as we followed our dogs out the door into the yard, the carport light startling awake at our presence and then nodding off again. You'll remember that it was late, our neighbors hours into sleep, so we spoke softly even as we began to really argue, this time about who locked the door on our way out. You'll remember that we gave up our prosecutions when we realized one of us had to hold the brittle ladder while the other climbed to the window we thought might be unlocked. Part cat burglar, part narcissistic voyeur, I paused after unfolding myself into the room, observing what we were when we weren't there. The television, mid-conversation, prattling on without us, my beer still cold, unmoved. You'll remember how the tails behind you wagged, how happy we were to have back what we had. I remember I felt so heroic giving that to you by just opening the door, which, I can tell you now, I'm certain I shut. And so I showed that to her, and she said, and this was years later, and she said, I knew it. And, you know, that's what happens. I'm sorry.
It's really hard to sit up here and just be quiet.
Anything you'd like to add? No. Here's another poem in which I apologize. This is called Butterfly Soup. And in it, a girl named Jane will appear. Jane is our neighbor, our old neighbor from Atlanta. She was like our practice daughter. She would come over and to play with our dogs, but I think she may have thought we were kind of cool to hang out with. And so she was like 8 when she started coming over. Now she's driving, and that's very scary. Butterfly Soup. There's really no grace to their names. Red peacock, green triangle kite, blue and brown clipper, and I should say these are the names of butterflies. A nomenclature of awkward plainness, because trying to describe the metallic, nearly turquoise wings of the blue morpho in 2 to 3 words would only end in failure. Our guide points to one, says it isn't actually blue, but that tiny scales on its wings scatter the light similar to the way dust molecules refract the sun's rays. When he finishes speaking, the boys in our group give chase to whatever flutters by them, while Jane, the only girl, keeps to the trail that leads down to where the artificial stream turns to go back through the filter, and we find the shredded fragments of so many wings, like confetti simmering in puddles after a parade. Or are they more like the fronds and stems of the fruit Chelsea was cutting for the salad last night? Her knife slid through the strawberries, the tiny green leaves, much lighter than the small amounts of red flesh they clung to, bobbed in the sink above the apple peels, melon, and orange rinds. I kissed her neck, said I was sorry for something, it hardly matters what. And without looking, she put a strawberry in my mouth. We dip our hands in the stream. Jane tells me butterfly soup probably wouldn't taste very good. To keep us from eating them, she says, the bright, beautiful things always have a bitter taste. I think that'll be the last poem I read from the book. We asked if the class wanted to hear new poems or old poems, and they said, a mix. So here's the mix. This poem is called The Hoax is a Hoax. It's sort of, we're talking again and again about what is fake news and what is reality, and if you go on Facebook, you'll sometimes see these uplifting videos, and then you find out a little bit later that they're all staged, and that's what this poem is about in part. It turns out that the picture of the receipt with the $5,000 tip for the pregnant server who had no health insurance was fiction. Her dead husband a lie, and the deep emotion the story produced in the thousands who loved and shared it, just another synthetic high that our brains are hardwired to crave, like fats and sugars, because such unctuous sweetness is supposed to be rare, and it is. So we gorge on it when we find it, as though it were our last meal for weeks, and this story is just another story, the kind we tell each other because we want people to be better than they are. And the video of the bunny that sprints joyful laps around the ottoman like a valence electron when its owner returns from Iraq or Afghanistan, is staged. The bunny trained, and the owner, not a soldier, but a manager at Dunkin' Donuts. So many forgeries, so many illusions now, that it's hard to tell the world we want from the world that kills us. So why not make a few things up? But still believe me when I tell you the story about how my grandmother, well into her 80s, woke up at 3:31. She remembers the time exactly, because a man was calling her name, but she saw no man, though she searched the house, and then looked outside and had a vision, the world on fire, as though she were inside a firework, or Armageddon itself, but it wasn't a vision. The neighbor's house was going up in flames. So she called 911, and before she hung up and walked outside, the fire trucks were there, and the family of 3 inside saved, barely. What do you make of the voice she heard? Some spasm of the brain reacting to the light across the street, a light that shouldn't have been there and wasn't visible from her bedroom anyway? What about your disbelief and my own? After the fire had been put out and the family taken to a shelter, my grandmother continued to search for the man whose voice she heard, certain that she'd find him and he would have more to say. So I mentioned Robert Frost. I've been thinking about Frost a lot. I said he was my first love for poetry. But when I was an undergrad at Allegheny College, my professor, I turned in like 2 or 3 sonnets. I think they used, between these 2 and 3 sonnets, I think they used the word hark like 5 times. And he said, okay, we're going to take Frost away from you. And so I put him away for a long, long time. And then this summer, I started reading this J. Perini biography of Frost and sort of gotten back into it. And he has a poem you probably know, Mending Wall, where he says, something there is that doesn't love a wall, and good fences make good neighbors. So that's important to know for this poem. I went to the Mending Wall once, and that's up in Derry, New Hampshire. And you can go see his old farm, and there's the wall that he inspired the poem. And as our tour group was going around, I went into the woods, followed the wall a little bit, and grabbed one of the rocks and stole it. I've always wondered if it's cursed or something like that. Would I have been a better poet had I left it there? I don't know. But this poem is called Mending Wall, because why not? It worked for Frost, and talks sort of about that story. Mending Wall, the Frost farm in Derry, New Hampshire. No one noticed as I left both the tour group and the path to follow the wall, the woods growing thicker, the wall itself crumbling, stones scattered like blocks on a child's floor. There was order, but barely, which told me these stones were the ones I wanted, obscure enough, I thought, to be authentic. Blistered over with lichen, the first few swarmed with larvae. Then I found one that was more loaf than ball, an axe head almost, and small enough to fit beneath my shirt, where it sanded down my skin, so my side bled slightly as I smuggled it into my car. And what did I want it for? So it can sit, as it does now, here on my desk, like a primitive weapon or an ugly charm. In part, I like it because nothing suggests it once made something, or rather, that it was part of something made, something actual that became abstracted when the homesick poet remembered it, and the farm he left when he moved to England, then wrote about them, constructing the wall in others' minds. In my mind, a thought I can touch now as though it were concrete evidence of thought itself, weighing roughly as much as a handshake. My own neighbor shook my hand on the porch we shared the day she was discharged from the hospital, inoperable pieces of bullet still lodged in her brain from the night her boyfriend shot her in the jaw and she drove herself back to the townhouse next to mine. I found her screaming outside of her door and held her until the ambulance came, and we shook hands weeks later, her neck in a brace, those shards permanent sparks in the x-rays of her skull. After the paramedics took her away, it was hours past midnight and so quiet. I wondered what my responsibilities were, and still do. Who knows if the stone is real? if the poet ever touched it. She said, "Thanks, neighbor," because she didn't know my name. And this will be your 2-poem warning before you get ready. This is, you guys know what a Portuguese man-of-war is? These awful little jellyfish. They're not really jellyfish, I found out. They're actually a bunch of different organisms combined together. We were down in, Chelsea's from Miami, and we were visiting her parents, but then we went down to the beach, and a storm had come in the night before, and there were just all of these Portuguese men-of-war scattered over the beach. And during this time, the poet Derek Walcott was very sick, and he's very soon after that passed away. And so this poem's in his memory. It's a little elegy for Derek Walcott, but it's called Portuguese Man-of-War. I don't imagine pain, but I do feel a sadness watching it throb on the sand like a blanket with a mouse inside. Mauve, shriveled, it reminds me of the birthday balloon my daughter wouldn't let me throw away, how it sunk each day for weeks, weighed to the floor by its own weight, or rather its failure to transcend that weight. Something of blown glass to this shape, or something neural, a brain and its nerves, and only that. What it might be like to be a mind without a body, instead of a body without a mind, which may be the case right now for the poet who's been in a coma for days and will die soon. Maybe the mind just drifts away, as these animals drift with the weather and the tide and time that shreds them as they reach the shore. Look at this one, its sail translucent, its inky tentacles taut as a line of verse. After the thing dies, they go on, stinging whatever touches them. And last poem. We moved up, we used to live in Atlanta, and 5 years ago, 6 years ago, it's been a long time now. We moved up to Young Harris, Georgia, which is very, very rural. Rome looks like a metropolis, to give you an idea. And cool, and we were sort of,
cool.
No, it wasn't cool at all. We were sort of kicking and screaming on the way up, and but then we started seeing animals, and I'd be like, oh great, there's a deer. I can go write my deer poem. And then I'd see a turkey, and here comes the turkey poem. There was a cow in the middle of the road one day on my way to class. I didn't write a poem about that though. But then Chelsea said, maybe the critter poems need to stop. And so I wrote this poem instead. It's called Ed Smith. And thank you all very much for being such a great audience. Ed Smith. Instead of deer or turkey in the yard, this morning we find Ed Smith, or a man who says he's Ed Smith. Elderly, dressed in a khaki jacket and pants, with a white polo tucked partially into his belt. He sits beside me now on our deck, while inside my wife calls the sheriff to see if anyone is looking for him. No one is. He knows nothing except the name, not even how he got here or why he would be walking at all just after sunrise. I ask him if he saw the cows in the meadow along the roadside, and he says no, that he didn't come that way, but I know it's the only way he could have come. I ask him if he's married, and he says no, then maybe. And I catch myself manufacturing a sort of condescending pity, condescending in the way that all pity is, thinking of him as a body with no self, a ghost in reverse, an orphan memory of someone else's grandfather now lost and unaware that no one knows who he is, including himself. In the old stories, the dead forget themselves and walk witless through the underworld like boats adrift and pilotless. And maybe that's why we invented the self or the soul or the spirit, some indelible quiddity that cannot die. Because this, to be forgotten by everyone, even our own minds, seemed, and it is, inexcusable, the worst sort of indignity. But maybe the spell will break and the hero will return, however briefly, to talk with the sheriff who'd otherwise be bored this Sunday in a county where nothing happens except for things like this. Maybe a wife will be found, or a son or a daughter who will laugh when picking him up, the laugh, the acceptance of what cannot be changed. So my wife and I wait for that someone who will know what to do, leaving Ed Smith to sit quietly in our chair without questions, his hand tapping his knee to the rhythm of a song that he's remembered or imagined and isn't there, but seems to be beautiful. All right, thank you very much.
That was really wonderful. So it's now my pleasure to introduce to you Chelsea Rathburn. Professor Rathburn is the author of 2 poetry collections. Her first collection, The Shifting Line, won a Richard Wilbur Award in 2005, and her second collection, A Raft of Grief, was the winner of the 2012 Autumn House Poetry Prize. Her poems have also appeared in Poetry, The Atlantic Monthly, The New Republic, The Southern Review, New England Review, The Threepenny Review, and Plowshares, among others. She received her MFA from the University of Arkansas, and in 2009 received a poetry fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. Originally in Miami, she now lives in Young Harris, Georgia, where she is assistant professor of English and creative writing at Young Harris College. Poet Timothy Steele said of The Shifting Line, Chelsea Rathburn's well-crafted poems honor the beauty and order of the world by accommodating its quirks and oddities. Time and time again, her straightforward, colloquial grace leads to unexpected yet convincing revelations about her subjects. This colloquial grace characterizes much of her work, which is often formally intricate but layered in the speech and mannerisms of daily life. We are drawn into the subjects' lives as though drawn into conversation with them. In the poem Eclogue with Paris and Prayer, which begins the second section of A Raft of Grief, the speaker and her partner try to tell the story of a visit to Paris and a frightening encounter on the cable car to Sacré-Cœur. From some perspectives, the encounter could have been a turning point in the relationship between the speaker and her partner, but in the end, Professor Rathburn writes, "The night was still the night, the rain falling harder, and we were who we'd always been. We were merely a little farther up the hill." In this and other poems, Professor Rathburn paints perceptive pictures of our relationships with our loved ones, the strangers around us, and ultimately ourselves. And please help me welcome Chelsea Rathburn.
Thank you so much. And thanks to Dr. Meek for having us here. Thanks to Adam. Brad, I got your name wrong. I am so sorry I just did that. Thank you to Brad. I'm in the anthology-inspired Georgia, so it's also really great to see the photographs here. Okay, I'm gonna put this down. Okay, I don't know why I suggested that I go second, because now I have to follow my husband. Yikes. Okay, I'm gonna read a few poems from my second book. I'm gonna begin with the title poem, A Raft of Grief, which is the one that is in Inspired Georgia. It's paired with that beautiful tree that's in the sort of middle of that wall.
The blue one?
Yeah, the blue one. Okay, so let's see. What do you need to know about this poem? I wrote this. Okay, so as you have, I'm sure, figured out by this point, Jim May is my second husband. I had a practice marriage. I married very young, and it was a very unhappy marriage pretty much from the beginning. I think I realized before my first husband and I were even announced at our wedding reception, you know what they say, like, please welcome Mr. and Mrs. or husband and wife. I remember standing there going, I've made a terrible mistake. So, yeah, it shouldn't be a surprise, I suppose. But in the period that I wrote this poem, my now ex-husband had moved out of our house, and about a day later, a letter came from the IRS saying that we owed $10,000, and it turned out to be a mistake. But there was this horrible, at the time, I was like, this is the worst week of my life. And I mentioned it to somebody, and they said, wow, what a raft of grief. Meaning, just what a lot of grief. But I had this sort of image flash across my mind of, oh gosh, if only. Okay. So this begins with a definition from the Morris Dictionary of Word and Phrase Origins, which reads, the raft that means a great number is not related at all to the raft that carries people or their possessions in the water. The two words are homonyms. Raft of grief. If only there were a boat, low and long and loaded with all we brought or built, the fatal inattentions, anxieties and tics that time had sanctified, our good and bad intentions, rages, lapses, and aches. If only it were that easy to stand only ankle deep in the sullied water, hoisting our shared cargo, sinking no further beneath its weight. If only the boat did not need a rower, we'd push it off together, then wade to opposite banks, absolved at last, forever, buoyant, watching it go. You're going to notice my poems are much shorter than my husband's, and my introductions are usually much longer. So, let's see. So this next poem is looking back on that first marriage. This is called The Talker. And I think the only thing you need to know about this, there are a few references to classic rock songs. And I think if you've, thank you, ever, sort of been around in the world, you should pick up most of them. The Talker. The details of his story aren't the point, nor is the listener, who looked as bored as we, two accidental eavesdroppers in a London restaurant. The point is, well, his point, which after 10 long minutes, he came to abruptly and with a flourish, saying slowly and in perfect seriousness, all we are is dust in the wind. All we are is dust in the wind. I think we bit our fingers to keep from laughing. I know we mocked him to Paris, Barcelona, Rome, and even years later, when one of us became a little too serious, the other would turn and quote his quote again, jabbing the air as he had jabbed the air. I picture him still sitting in some cafe, proclaiming we were always born to run, or urging wayward sons to carry on, the way we tried to carry on, the couple at the next table, who couldn't help but listen, with so little of our own to talk about. And I will read a poem that came up in our class visit today. This is called How to Cope. These are instructions to the self.
What page is it on? What page is it on?
Gosh, 14. I have really terrible eyes.
You know, it's fine.
So like an instruction manual merged with a poem. How to cope. Develop watchfulness early. Sort the detritus of the pockets to count bottle caps. Check the open vodka for water. Listen for the key scraping the lock, for the call from the authorities. Sleep with one ear open. Look for their tell, the slight slur, the narrowing eyes, a benign gratitude, and take them away the minute they begin calling everyone in the Mexican restaurant Pedro. They are now less than one drink from rolling on the neighbor's lawn or curling into the fetal position to tell you they hate their life and everyone in it. The truth is, you like them more when they have been drinking. The truth is, they like you more when they have been drinking. Deliver threats they won't remember in the morning. Accept explanations and subterfuge, as in, I don't have a drinking problem, I have a drinking and driving problem. Or, it looks like someone's caught the vino virus again. Construct elaborate proofs and theories. If there are 16 bottle caps, he must have offered to open someone else's beer. Perhaps he's allergic to wine. And though you walk through the world expecting it to break, believing that those you love will always lie to you, tell yourself they never mean to. Do not wash the vomit off the steering wheel. You have to draw the line somewhere. And I think I'll go from there to extending the alcohol metaphors a little bit further. Page 18, if you're following along. This is called After Filing for Divorce. After Filing for Divorce. And the extended metaphor, this is probably obvious, painfully obvious at this point. My ex-husband had a drinking and driving problem. So after filing for divorce, your paperwork in, it's like the morning after a party. The shaken survey of damage, a waste of bottles where there was laughter. It all seems so much more than you can manage. The accusing cups and stubbed out cigarettes, the sun assaulting the window, your throbbing head. It's not enough to face your own regrets, but they're coming back fast, the things you said. Because someone's trailed bean dip across the table, someone's ground salsa in the rug with his shoe. So you start to clean, as much as you are able, and think how far those hours have fled from you, before the hangover and your sour tongue, when you felt lovely and infinite and young. So, I'm going to skip over the second section of this book, which, as Siobhan mentioned, the middle section of the book is a series of imagined conversations between this couple. And in the first one, they're sort of reporting on this trip to Paris to a listener. It's kind of like what I did on my summer vacation, sort of slideshow. And then they end up just arguing a lot and separating. I didn't intend it to be autobiographical exactly, although that's how everybody reads it. So I'm going to skip over that because I would have to force him to come up and read a part. They're all in two different voices. So I'm going to go to the third section instead. And let's see, Jim read a couple of apologies. So I'm going to read a poem called Apology. The hero of the book has now arrived. The divorce is finalized. This is apology. Forgive me, love, for almost enjoying your nightmare, the one where I had disappeared or been taken or left. A dream so clear you woke me calling my name, your nickname for me, a single crushed syllable, from whatever dark plane you were trapped in until I shook you from it. Of all the ways I love my name on your voice, traveling up from our kitchen or study on some practical fact-finding mission, dutiful as a carrier pigeon, or on the far end of a phone, or in the last long and practical motions of desire, I think I liked it best breaking my sleep that night. For what more could I ask from my life than to be wanted like that? And when I let myself be found, and you clung to me selflessly, shaking, and told me the dream, I almost wished that I were lost, that you might look for me. Let's see, how am I out of time? Okay. I think I'll read one more poem from the book and then a few new things. We were talking a good bit this afternoon with the intermediate poetry workshop about truth and lies, and which of our poems are made up and which aren't. And so this is a poem that kind of speaks to that. Usually if I write it, it's happened. And that's not always the case with this guy. This is called In Krakow, and that just becomes the first line. In Krakow, we discover that almost none of your poems have actually happened, and most of mine have, which could point to a serious lack of imagination on my part, or an inability to make metaphors out of real experience in yours. But more importantly means that the narrative I've constructed of your life before me, sliding away like those perfect gold bows of satin ribbon tied around our rented apartment curtains. I took pictures of them, knowing that once I untied them to draw the shades, I'd never get them right again. They fell into a puddle of gold. Forgive me for reading you like a schoolgirl, knowing how my own eye skips across the past. And maybe it doesn't matter, Jim, if the moments I wanted to believe in most were fictions, or if almost none and most are a kind of fiction too. Didn't Adam tell us here, this is Adam Zagiewski, Polish poet, didn't Adam tell us here that the greatest tragedy of a poet dying lies not in the death itself, but in the problem of final authority, that there should never be a last poem, since every new one is a correction of what came just before. I tell you now that you already know that the curtains weren't in Krakow, but Paris, our apartment looking out over Notre Dame. Here our balcony faces pigeons and a lonely or angry dog. A week has passed and I'm already revising reality, the public and private, in the smallest ways, just as your spoken Polish does not change, but for your confidence in delivering it. Last night's waitress correcting every phrase, another assuming you had family here. It may be too soon to forget our argument, your headaches, my cough, but by the time we fly home, they will be woven into something more romantic and more or less the truth. The angry dog snarling from the balcony, is already merging with the melancholy notes of the trumpeter who marks time from a church tower, making something sadder and sweeter than an angry dog. I'll take it all. That vicious or bored shepherd, the trumpeter's broken notes, the market square, 2 blocks from where we both sit writing, the now and the revisions of the now. What we know is here between us, and what we'll choose to share or give away. Okay, and so then, unfortunately for him, he drops out of the book that I've just finished. I've got a new manuscript that I've got coming out in, I guess, about a year and a couple months. So I just thought I would read a couple of poems from that. And the book is going to be called Still Life with Mother and Knife. And it deals with the female body, with motherhood, childhood, works of art. There's a phrastic section in the middle that is kind of a conversation with a Eugene Delacroix painting of Medea, famous monstrous mother. But I'm not going to read those, I don't think. I'm going to start with some of these mother childhood, girlhood poems, and I'll read a few, so we'll see how we do on time. This is a poem that begins the book. It's called Postpartum, a Fairy Tale. The pages of our storybook childhoods were ripped from the Brothers Grimm, the woods always in shadow, the apples poisoned, the ladders made of bone. Our mothers telling us, early, how much they loved and loathed us, how my aunt had wished to find my cousin drowned in the washing machine, while my mother hoped her cat would climb the walls of my crib and steal my breath. Our longed-for endings told gleefully and in the passive voice. Those days were gone, they told us, but we wondered. If, as Bettelheim writes, the witches and giants and the brutal fairy tales are really stand-ins for the parents the child is afraid to fear and love, what did we make of our mother's revelations, which made us the monstrous creatures, changelings left by trolls, that they could not or would not save us, that we had to learn to walk the woods alone? I'm going to stick with my mother for a minute. This is called Introduction. I should say the first section of the book, all of the poems are introduction to something. It's like an education in how to be a girl, basically. This one is Introduction to Home Economics. I'm not convinced my mother ever forgave me for carving, instead of the jack-o'-lantern, the hand she used to steady it in her lap. We sat on the porch with a kitchen knife, newspapers spread beneath us. The pumpkin skin was stubborn, my mother left-handed. I was 6. My mantra, let me try. Then blood and blood and blood. Then tourniquets of towels and the rush to the ER, my father driving. I stayed behind with a neighbor, my mother returning with black stitches, her hand wrapped like a mummy's, to finish the face we'd start. Each Halloween, she brought it up again, reminding me what I had done, how I had hurt her, though she was the one who handed me the knife. And I'm going to go into the woods. Here, this is Introduction to Statistics. Suppose we surprised him, coming off the path into the patch of pines and saw palmettos, 2 girls with our child-sized bikes. Suppose he had a reason to chase us back to the path, his pale face flushed with what? Desire? Wrath? He shouted, come back, but we fled. Who knows what he was doing there in the woods? Impose an innocent narrative, and still the math will come out wrong. There was a flash of skin, a man in yellow shorts with dark brown curls, a shout. And in the dream that I'm still in, he stumbles out, a living question mark, and we are halfway gone. We're only girls playing in the woods. It's hours before dark. And, is there one more? Gotta go. Yeah. I'll do one more. This one's a doozy. Okay, this is Introduction to Patriarchy. I think I mentioned that there's a lot of the poems in the book have to deal with the female body, and it's artistry. I modeled for a time in college. I modeled for a female sculptor, so an artist model. So this is not that. Introduction to Patriarchy. For a while, we found them everywhere we looked, tucked in our brothers' closets or slipped inside our father's attachés. Carousels of airbrushed women with rumpled curls, wearing sweaters or raincoats or negligées or nothing but shoes. Their feet were never bare. Bedecked in stockings and heels as tall as stilts, it seemed the women always had to grab a hold of something strong, a door frame, say, or a fire hose, or lean across a bed to keep from toppling. Top heavy, lips wet, one arm lifted or crossed, they waited for us. Side by side, our bodies hairless, all lines and sharp angles, we studied their proportions. We read about their favorite centuries, the 20th, because women can finally pursue their own individuality and potential, and ideal men, and memorize their vague ambitions. Ranking their parts, we fought over who got to be Miss October or Miss April when we played, what's the game? It can't be called dress up if we undressed. Instead of doctors or astronauts, we channeled waitresses in a topless bar. We practiced carrying trays and looking vacant or surprised. When our big breaks came, we posed for centerfolds, eager to please the invisible camera. We leaned against the wall or dropped to our hands and knees, our smiles fixed, until our father's voices sent us fumbling for our clothes. Thank you. On that note, I should have mentioned that quote came from a Playboy magazine, the questionnaires that they do with the centerfolds. So I had a lot of fun this summer going back through old vintage Playboys. There are people that post them online and reading all of the Q&As. So, speaking of Q&As, do you want to, if anyone has questions for either of us, we would be happy to answer them. So, but no pressure.
This one is for James.
Yeah.
The poem with the neighbor who got shot in the mouth, is that true? Or
Yeah, I was in Houston, and I've written another poem about it too. It's just one of those things that I heard her yelling outside. I was talking to a friend on the phone, and I said, I gotta go check on this. And she had been shot through the neck, and it came out of her jaw. She drove back home. But yeah, that was scary, spooky.
I know that you mentioned that you know because more about like female body and like mothers and daughters and that kind of thing. And I want to know if there's going to be more poems like the introduction to patriarchy where you kind of address like female sexualization.
Are there others that are explicitly?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Cool. I think that was like the most. I should remember, finding different times, man. I don't know if you guys grew up with Playboys all over the house, but I sure did. Yeah, I have a friend who is about my age, a year or so older, and she had a bunch of older brothers, and it was like this same thing. Yeah, I don't think that happens anymore. But yeah, like I said, I'm trying to think, I don't have this table of contents memorized yet. But the first section of the book really is sort of thinking about, I guess becoming a mother a mother to a daughter has made me think a lot about my own childhood and sort of some of the traumas and close calls and different problematic things that happened, which I have a lot of anxiety about now watching my daughter grow up. And so, yes. Cool, awesome. Any questions? And I should say, I feel bad now. That poem that I read in Krakow, I was really talking about his early poems. When we first got together, I said this in the class today, but when we first got together, he had all these fictional poems, and we had just started dating, and I'm trying to, it's like, wow, this is so cool dating another writer. And it's like you're trying to learn about each other, and I'm getting this sense of his life history and everything through his poems, which he would share with me, things that he had published. And then a while later, I discovered that they were not true. How do you do that? They're mostly true now. Yeah, Becky?
Do you guys talk to each other a lot about your poems? Like, do you share those often with each other?
Yeah, I mean, Chelsea, I give her my poems first, and I don't really send them to anyone else except for maybe one friend, but we go back and forth again and again. Yeah, it's a very nice working relationship in that way, right? So.
Yeah, he's my trusted reader, and vice versa, which is good. Rick?
Yeah, I got two questions that relate to the last two questions. Has your ex ever read that you know of?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, he's read some of the poems. I know. I remember when he's a musician, and he.
That explains a lot.
Yeah. He used to write a lot of songs about us when we were together, unhappy songs. I remember there was a line in a song that was something like, "And you're right. Of course you're always right." Yeah. But I do remember at some point, I think maybe showing him, we were amicable for a long time. Now we're not. But I think maybe showing him a poem, he made some comment like, well, I guess I've moved on to other subject matter. Oh, I guess maybe I screwed you up less than you screwed me up. I don't know.
And the second question, do you ever find yourself holding back lines because you're both writers, getting ready to say something and say, well, I don't want to, she might take that.
You mean that Chelsea might write the line instead of me, or
Right.
she might not like the
Well,
line?
yeah, that she might take the line. She may use the line.
Oh, go ahead, you have something to say.
I was just going to say, not in the sense of, I'm scared of sharing poetic lines, but yes, we often have situations that come up, and an argument, let's say, and then we're both sort of like, don't you put this in a poem. or one of us will turn to the other and be like, you're going to write about this, aren't you?
Yeah, because poets, I hang out with a poet sometimes, and they tend to say things certain ways, and you can tell that they hear things as well. Things that you say might show up later if you're not careful.
Yeah.
And,
So do we hold back what we say to each other?
Right,
Yeah.
you hold back because you've got a good line that you don't want to give away.
Right.
You hold back because you've got a bad line that you really don't want to see later.
No, I don't think so. I think there's often a race to write a poem. If a situation happens, there was we were in Poland, and we asked the waiter to describe the menu, and he ended up. Chelsea asked him, there was stuffed duck. Cool. What's the duck stuffed with? And he says, Madam, the duck is stuffed with more duck. But we both had this sort of moment where we wanted to run back right away. I won, by the way. I got it in there. So there's that. But I don't think I've ever not said a line because I thought you would steal it or anything like that.
You will now.
Have you ever wrote about the same moment?
Yes. There's a poem in her book called Small Deaths that I was very upset about in some ways because we found a dead baby possum in our yard.
Oh.
And she wrote a really great poem about it, and then I wrote a poem that's basically mourning the fact that she's written it.
Never thought of it that way.
Yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah. No, we set up little challenges. He's got a poem. Andrew, is it?
Yeah.
Andrew, right? He has a poem where he describes me writing, and he says I'm trying to rhyme pain. Was it pain with paying attention?
Pain with paying attention.
Yeah, but I couldn't. In his poem, he said I couldn't make that rhyme. So I have a poem in the book that pairs pain and paying attention, which is like an answer they have. It makes me, I can do that. Avery, did you?
Kind of. Okay. So Jim, you had a recent poem about fake news, alternative facts and stuff, and you said something along the lines of people fake that sweetness because it's so rare. Is that why what you would say you do for your poems? Why you like to fabricate for the sake of the?
I hope not. We were talking about, I can't remember what the question was that got me thinking about this during the class, but in my poetry, I'm a cynical, what did you say? I'm a caustic bald man. You should call me this once. And, but in my poems, I hope I'm a little, I move towards sweetness, but I hope there's a good amount of doubt, so it's just not sweetness for its own sake. We keep talking about him, but Adam Zagajewski has a great little, it's like a mini essay, it's like this long, and he says in it that there are two elements in all poetry, ecstasy and irony. Ecstasy accepts the world and praises it, irony doubts it. And he said all poems have to have this, and sort of maybe the idea behind it is how do you calibrate the irony and ecstasy. So I hope that there's irony and sort of doubt in the poem, so they're not just overly sweet. But I'm constantly aware of that when reading a poem, and you know, is this poem just being sweet for sweetness' sake? Yeah.
He's really a very sweet person. Well, we were asked in class to describe each other's, like what we admired about each other's work, and he said some very nice things about mine, and afterwards I was like, I think I was jokey or something, and then I felt bad. You've heard his work, his work's amazing. So it moves in ways that I can't make my poems move the way that he can, with a syntactical density and just great stuff. So I'm trying to make up.
No, it's fine. She said, what did you say? I used to think he was a jerk, and then I'd read his poems.
Did I say that?
Something like that. Yeah. Some of you were there. You can all talk about it later. You can write poems about it. So.
Reminds me of that student evaluation. You got a teaching evaluation years ago.
I used to think he was a jerk, and then I just realized that was his personality. Might be a good place to end. Any other questions? One more? Yeah?
For both of you, what is the hardest poem you have to write, technically and or emotionally?
They're all hard, I think. Well, no, I'd say this. There are only like maybe one or two poems that just write themselves, and that's a rare thing. So there's a poem called Fringe Tree in there, and that sort of just wrote itself. But I can't think of a poem that was easy to write, and I can't think of a poem that, I mean, the poems that are really, really hard they're still in draft form, right? So they sit there. Do you have an answer?
I don't know. There was one that I talked about in class earlier, English sonnet, where it was, I wanted to write a sonnet that was set in London, so that when I said English sonnet, I would be describing the structure of the sonnet, English sonnet being another term for Shakespearean sonnet, but they would also be English in subject matter, and I also wanted to see if I could include a joke in its entirety in a poem, in a rhyming, highly rhyming poem. So that was challenging, and that went through a bunch of drafts. I remember a friend, at one point I had a line, and he said, this sounds like, George Michael's song, or Wham, I think, Careless Whisper. So this is, it's close, but it's not quite there yet. And, that one technically was tough. But, I don't know. I mean, a lot of times you're trying to process things. I've alluded to this thing that happened several times today. I had an old friend who was shot to death in a workplace massacre several years ago. And I was still trying to sort it all out, figure it out. And he went off and wrote a poem about it, which is in his book, and it's a great poem. But I was really angry at the time. And the subsequent poems that I wrote were particularly difficult. I think partly because I had his poem, the shadow of his poem kind of hanging over me by that point. And I was trying to make sense of this senseless death. And, yeah, but I didn't read those tonight, so. Yeah.
One last question. And it's, what is the longest time that you have spent on a poem? So, and that's for both of y'all.
I mean, years.
Yeah.
Years.
That's what I'm saying. I was saying it was like years, but I just
Yeah.
didn't know if you had like.
Yeah, I mean,
like,
I-
oh yeah, it's been like 10 years.
Yeah, no, I go dozens and dozens of drafts, so.
Yeah.
So lots.
I'd say years as well.
Yeah, but then sometimes you get lucky, you know, and you sit down and it's
There.
there. Yeah. Yeah. So, do you have a question behind?
I was just gonna ask if there's a sense where you teach of the poetry that's coming out of Northeast Georgia for Byron Reese. Is there like something on campus that commemorates that, or is that something that they consider important?
He's asking about Byron Herbert Reese, who taught at our college up until his death. And there's a nice little farm not very far away from where we teach called the Reese Farm. It's really beautiful if you're up that way.
And his archives are in our library.
Yeah, and our named reading is the Byron Herbert Reese Lecture, so that's our big reading every year. So yeah, we have a lot of the Reese archives and things like that. So.
So there's a place for poetry that's kind of made for you there.
Yeah,
You get to
yeah.
have it, that's nice.
Yeah. Nice. So, well, thank you all so much for being here.
Oh.
This is a question of everybody.
Okay,
We
wait.
started this last year.
Okay,
What are
go.
your- Oh, you got it?
Yeah.
What are your opinions on Beyonce?
It's just a great one. I don't know.
We have a 5-year-old, so we listen to things like, I am an alligator. There's not really a whole lot of, we don't have much control over the radio right now. And so I don't think we're allowed to have opinions. We're not even allowed to listen to anything. So I've been listening, my daughter has made me listen to the Nightmare Before Christmas song, This Is Halloween.
Yes.
Over and over and over again, and it's still going on. So I hope that's an acceptable answer.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Long time.
Yeah.
Thank you.